Alright, so today we're going to do a tutorial on phase 3 of Skanf's no spin knife throwing method using the regular feed and grip, right? um, Today we're going to be using the knives by Kim Vitali, the Spets 5 BRUT or Brute, specifically made for Skanf. So before we get started, knife throwing is a dangerous activity, so if you're going to do this, you are doing so at your own risk. And if you are going to do this, please make sure you are taking the necessary safety precautions to minimize any injuries, be mindful of rebounds, and have fun training. So let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Phase 3, or lesson 3 in this case. Phase 3, I previously mentioned, would be about the wrist, right? Rotation around the wrist. To be more precise, phase 3 is actually going to be more about what's happening at the wrist. So we're going to talk about a lot of what to be mindful of here and what to be aware of. As usual, the key concepts are going to be always in play here. And this time I'm actually going to emphasize every single thing, hopefully down to the level at the wrist. What I'm going to say here is going to sound repetitive. You heard it already in lesson 1 or phase 1 and lesson 2 or phase 2. But it really is emphasizing. I'm going to try to give some insights to kind of go a little bit further here. So let's go ahead and get started. So there are generally 3 main concepts that we keep touching on when we talk about Skanf. The first one, in terms of the mechanism, or at least in terms of the process, the first one I'm going to focus on that revolves around phase 3 is the loading launching motion, right? Or the loading launching wave. Load and then launch. Load and launch. And what you want to pay attention to here is that when you are doing the loading, right? What you're trying to do is you're loading the index finger with energy. Now I have mentioned this before and I explained why earlier, but for those of you who might have forgotten, or just in case, let's go ahead and recap. We're trying to load the finger with energy because we're going to take advantage of the passive pushing that comes from loading the finger. There's an exercise that a couple of Skanf practitioners have shown, Mikhail Belyaev, Mikhail Fedin, and Alexei Adam, as well as Joel Halapainen. He showed this in one of his tutorial videos, and it's an exercise that you can do just to feel how much of an effect it has. Sorry, give me a moment. And that is to put your hand on the table, right, on a flat surface, and tap as loud and as hard as you can actively. Like, just really try to make a loud noise. I'm gonna do it on the knife here so you can kind of hear the clinging, right? Now, compare that to using your other hand and flicking the finger back fast and hard, right? Suddenly you can hear that even louder, and it starts to hurt your finger. That's how much energy there is when you're using the elasticity of your finger to your advantage. Okay, so that's why we are loading the knife. Now, that's the first part. Loading the knife, we're focusing on loading the elastic tendon, I guess you could say. I'm not sure if it's a tendon or whatever it is, but you're stretching it and having it pull back in order to apply a passive but powerful push onto the knife. And again, I mentioned this before, the reason why we're doing that is so that it applies the push, but we don't have to think about it, okay? Unlike trying to actively spring or actively brush as you slide out and trying to maintain like the right amount of the springing or the right amount of brushing, this one just kind of does it for you. You don't have to think about it. The second key thing about loading is when you're practicing this, especially if you're new, and well, even if you're experienced, one thing you'll notice a lot of times is whenever you're loading, look at how it's loaded, right? You do not want to load like this. What's the difference here between this and the previous one? The straightness. So what's the difference between loading up like this and loading up like this? It's how horizontal it is. Okay, that's one thing you want to make sure you understand here. When you're loading it up, imagine you are going to throw the knife back, away from you, behind you, right? and make sure it is as horizontal flat as possible, because at that point it is definitely going to be applying more pressure onto the elasticity of your finger. Whereas going up to here, there's not much elasticity going on, right? So we're trying to take advantage of the finger's elasticity here. So load it up, make sure it goes all the way back. You can do it from the overhand throw or even the sidearm throw. From sidearm throw, right, you just load it up. Now, I want to say that's the general way of doing it. Some people, some Skanf practitioners will have a different way of loading up the knife in a very similar manner. It's just the timing of when it happens. Here are the two ways that you will see them, see us load it. The first one you already know, where it's just 1, 2, right, when we throw it. 1, 2. The second way you might see us load it is we'll load it up, but not actually, we'll be in the motion, but we haven't loaded up yet until we pull, where the pulling moves forward, and because the knife's inertia is in play, it lags behind and creates the elasticity as we're in motion to pull already. So the second one looks like this, and there. So what's happening is this: 1, boom, boom. It's a very, very flat, a very fast motion. Okay. And to a lot of people who look at this, it might look like a flick of the wrist. Okay. So that's basically the loading waves that we're talking about. So recap on that. 1, the loading motion, loading wave, launching wave. The loading motion is to load your finger with potential energy and taking advantage of the elasticity. 2, make sure when you load, it is pointing straight back. Do not just go up to this level, right? And this is right now overhand. If you're doing sidearm, do not just go up to here, right? Do not just go up to here. You gotta go, make sure it points back. Make sure it points back. And then 3, there are 2 ways you can load. Load and then throw, or set up, and then as you throw, you create the load, and then you kind of snap with the wrist. Well, let me rephrase that. It's gonna look like you snap with the wrist. I'll explain what I mean by that in section 3 of this tutorial. So that was section 1, the loading and launching. Section 2 is going to be about the pulling. Okay, and you've heard me say this before. In Skanf, there's a saying: pull, don't push. And I've made a modification to that saying, and I think it's because originally it was lost in translation. Pull, don't actively push. In other words, think about the pulling, focus on pulling, don't think about having to push actively, right? Remember how I mentioned about this? This is active pushing, where you're actually trying to push, versus passive pushing, where something else is causing your finger to flick, and from the perspective of the knife, it's getting pushed, right? So focus on the pulling. But let's go ahead and dive into what it means to pull. In typical sense, usually when you're pulling something, wherever the direction is that you're pulling, your elbow is likely leading ahead of the wrist. So if you're pulling something that's above, pulling it down, right? Look at what's going first. The elbow is in front of the wrist. It's going first in that direction. Something that's in front of you and trying to pull back, right? What leads first in that direction? Your elbow compared to your wrist, right? Your elbow leads first compared to the wrist. Something behind you and you're trying to pull forward, well, look at this. Even this arm, elbow leads first in that direction compared to the wrist. And also this arm, right? Now I could be in this angle, but the energy and the intent is still pulling using the elbow in that direction. Okay? All right, another key thing about pulling here, sorry, let me check the camera. Another key thing about pulling here, when you're pulling the knife, you want to make sure the knife is traveling on a straight track as much as possible. If you go back to lesson 1, right, or phase 1, remember how I showed you when you're learning to throw the first time to Once you hit the launching point, let the arm fully extend straight, right? But relaxed, and just let everything flow. If you remember that, then here's something to take away from that. The arm extension, especially if you're new to knife throwing, the arm extension helps you to practice pulling the knife in as straight a track as possible. What do I mean by straight track? A straight track? Well, the other way you could throw this is with a slashing curved pathway. Boom. See this curve right here? Right? From sidearm, the straight track would look like this. Right? You see this? It follows along a straight track as I throw. But a curved track would look like this. See how there's this big curve? A slashing, cutting curve, right? So we're trying to keep it as straight as possible as opposed to a very large slashing curve. I actually mentioned this before as well. If you were to crack a bullwhip, right? If you were to crack a whip, there are two ways you can crack. Slashing style cracking, just to basically cut. Or if there was a candle right here with a flame, and you're trying to put out that flame by precisely cracking right there, there's that kind of pulling the whip as well to crack. Okay? So now, there are two ways you can initiate pulling. If you watch Skanf practitioners, you'll notice there are two ways that you'll see some of them move. For example, if you watch Alexi Adam, he always seems to take a step. He always does something that looks like this, right? When he throws, takes a small step, and that small step in itself, if I just hold the knife here, if I take a step, see that track? That small step makes the knife move along that track, and that helps. But you also have Miss Olga Fedina, who doesn't take a step, for example, right? And what she's doing is she has a slight extension here to allow it. Her technique is pretty refined, so it's requiring less of that movement. And usually also the further apart that you go, the further away from the target you go, the more you're gonna want a straight track to help, I guess, stabilize the knife in flight. So that's one way you can initiate pulling. You can pull with a step, or you can just pull with the arm and have it go on a straight track. And sometimes this is exactly why you see some people who throw like this, right? You don't have to stop here. You don't have to whip and stop here. You just let it go. As long as you're initiating the same concepts that happen behind the scenes. So let's recap on the pull. The definition of the pull: elbow leads. So whenever you're doing the launching wave, you should be leading with the elbow, right? And then try to keep the knife pulling on a straight track as much as possible. Try to avoid curvature type motions. And finally, there are two ways you can create the pull. In fact, actually the third way is to combine both of the two ways. The first one is to take a step, right? And then the snap, or snap and use the arm to create the track. Okay, now let's go ahead and do or talk about the third section of phase 3. And that's going to be, how do you get that snappy look of the throw? What's happening mechanically and internally in order to give that kind of result? This one's really tricky. And in fact, I need to cover quite a few things here, so it might jump around a bit. But for now, let's start off with the pushing. There's a very good chance subconsciously somewhere, especially the more you go further from the target, that you're going to accidentally push the knife. And you don't mean to, but your body tells you because it feels like it needs that extra push, right? That could happen in the second half of your launch. The first half you're pulling, that's great, and then suddenly in the second half you end up slightly flicking it without intending to. You gotta find a way to turn that off. And one thing you could do There's actually a few exercises. Miss Olga Fedina has some videos on her YouTube channel that show you how to do this. But one of them, the one that I like to do, at least just because it kind of gets you to learn how to turn it off, is to stay about a meter, right? Start off at a meter away from your target. When you throw, actively lock your wrist back. Try your best not to actively go forward. If it goes forward more so because of the rebound, it's okay. Because when you stop hard, you know, it's hard to like lock this back and pull back, especially if you're trying to do a whipping motion, right? But try to avoid having the wrist bend forward and actively think of holding it back. And it should look something like this. Remember the loading wave? Loading back, right? Notice how it's kind of locked back. I have the mentality and the mindset to try to keep my wrist back as I pull on the straight track toward the target. Now, because your wrist is being pulled back, you'll find that when you snap and you try to stop this motion, it will feel much easier to pull back, because you'll notice your hand will suddenly bounce off because your intention was already to go that way the moment it gets a chance, right? So that's one way you can kind of get there, and it'll kind of help you learn about keeping everything in place, because with the weight and the energy going forward, it's really hard to lock this here. There's going to be some slight rebound, and this is good because it's going to allow you to take advantage of the elasticity without accidentally pushing or over pushing too much. Now, there's another thing to help bring awareness here to what's going on. When you're doing this snapping thing, you want to avoid this. I keep mentioning this. This is more likely the reason you are over rotating your knife, right? So how do you learn to avoid that? Move your elbow, lead with your elbow. Move your elbow first and have your wrist follow along like you're creating this wave, right? Like a flame. And I want you to think about the energy traveling all the way up to the fingertips, okay? And more so your index finger, because that's how you're gonna be holding your knife, right? Now, I also want you to think about trying to do a one-handed clap. I'm not talking about this. This is actively clapping. Try to do it with the whipping motion, but do not do it where you're doing this to pull it, snap it back into clap. This is not what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for, right? Notice the wrist doesn't really bend too much, but the energy travels through and causes the fingers to snap back and do a very light one-handed clap. Now, if you look very closely, it looks almost like I'm pushing, but I'm doing so by leading with my elbow. I'm leading with my elbow that pulls, and it's like invisibly pushing a wave through my arm into the palm, and I'm gonna try to just let it ride out. If you're having trouble understanding this, another thing you can do is you can do this on a table, but I suggest doing it on a mattress or a bed. Just put your arm on the bed, right? And imagine you're gonna do a wave, right? Starting with the elbow, going up. Maybe there's like a ball going through, and your arm is going here. Now here's what I want you to do. As you're doing this, right now the energy is going up and down, right? Because this goes up, the elbow goes up, the elbow goes down, the wrist goes up, the wrist goes down. I want you to think about it pushing the energy forward, right? There's gonna be a little bit of that pullback and then pulling forward as this goes down. It's almost very similar to when you're trying to spread the bed sheets, right? You have the bed sheets there, you load up the bed sheets, and then you don't just pull down, because pulling down does nothing. You pull down, but you try to pull it forward, and it's almost like you're trying to push an air bubble through to spread out the bed sheets across, right? But remember, you're doing it all by pulling, right? And by pulling the whole thing, you're creating this energy traveling forward to the fingertip. And that's the same energy that you're applying to the knife, right? And that's what's happening when we're doing this, okay? And there you go. And that's what's happening when you're putting it all together. So when you put it all together, you load the knife, either this way or this way, and then load up the finger. So you're loading up the finger, loading up the knife, pull on a straight track, and then just imagine that same thing that you're doing with this, right? Whether it's sidearm, overhand, and let the knife go. And once you have that down, now it's just putting it all together as one unit, the whole body. You can either step, right? Or torque your hip, or do both. And then your hips will pull your elbow, which pulls the wrist, which pulls the knife. You put that all together, it should work out. As you start practicing going further and further back, be mindful that your body likely is going to try to interject and add a little push because it feels like it might not make it. Try to avoid the pushing for now, especially do not push with the wrist. But don't push with the finger, not yet. That's something else that can come along later on. Let me go ahead and give one bonus here. This is more so an insight and just like what makes Skanf a beautiful art. As you already know, Skanf is very, very internal. There's a lot happening from the main body that manifests the energy and pushes it out to the knife. And here's why it's a beautiful art. This is just one aspect of why it's a beautiful art. Think about everything I've said so far, and every component, especially conceptually speaking. The biggest things I've talked about is loading the knife, right? And the pulling, but loading the knife. And I mentioned a lot about the elasticity. Well, let's expand our repertoire of techniques here and start looking at reverse grip. How can you use elasticity and reverse grip and pull it? We use the finger in feed and grip, but is the finger the only thing that has an elastic tendon or ligament? Not necessarily. It's also in other parts of our body. So how can we apply the same principles of loading the energy and then using the elasticity to help pull the knife as we pull? You can figure that out. You will notice that will allow you to throw from different angles and different grips. And now you just gotta play around with it to find out how to make it work. And that's it. So that's pretty much it for these lessons. I don't know about me expanding into anything else in any time in near future, or if at all. But if you're looking to accelerate your learning, I highly recommend that you reach out to a Skanf instructor. As usual, I recommend my teacher, Mikhail Belyaev. His information is going to be in the description box below, so you can check it out there. Aside from that, happy training, train safe. Remember, you're doing this at your own risk if you're doing it, but if you're doing it, take the necessary safety precautions and have fun. See you next time.